Good morning, everybody. We are so excited today. We have Jennifer Dasal. Is that how you spell your last name? Or okay. Oh, yay. I nailed that. Okay. So she is a local art historian. She works at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And so she's going to be doing a presentation today on Michelangelo and Raphael. Is that correct? Okay.
That's right.
All right. So we're super excited. We also are joining Overture Carey on this as well. So there's Hannah. She's a lifestyle coordinator at Overture Carey. So we're super excited to have them as well. And so we'll have different residents join on. We're actually going to record this ahead of time and then people can go back and watch it and things like that. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me here today. I am always thrilled to share about art and art history in any way that I can. As Lauren said, I'm Jennifer. I work as a curator at the North Carolina Museum of Art as my full-time day job. And then on the side, I do a podcast called Art Curious, which is a free bi-weekly show when we are in season, which we are currently out of season, but still releasing episodes. And I like to explore what I call the fun part of art, what I call the unexpected, slightly odd, and strangely wonderful in art history. So my goal is to make art history interesting and maybe a little exciting and not at all boring like you might remember from
No.
So I am excited to be here to share with you a story that I really love, which is about the rivalry between Michelangelo and Raphael back in the Italian Renaissance. So I'm going to go ahead and present my screen, and then I will be sharing this really fun story with you. So here we go. I've never shared my screen on Google Meet before, so this is all new for me. All right. Can everybody see that okay on your guys' side?
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So when I was an undergraduate in college, I took what I think many people consider to be kind of the holy grail of introductory art history classes. And that was one that was specifically on the Italian Renaissance. And it's odd to say, but this course actually changed my life because it was the class that made me love art so much that I immediately began the process of changing my major from a major that was in geology, a science major, to becoming an art history major. And at the time I thought, what's not to love? Because I was learning about all these artists that were so spectacular that you only needed one name to identify them. Leonardo, Donatello, Raphael, Titian, Michelangelo. But when I was reading one of the assigned texts for that course, a book called Renaissance Rivals by a historian named Rona Goffin, I learned that there was really very little camaraderie and cooperation between these real-life namesakes. And when it comes to one of this pair of artists, one of these pairs, the rivalry was incredible. It was truly epic because both were really vying for the same patrons, and their professional contempt for one another got really ultra personal very quickly. So today I am excited to share with you the story of the rivalry between the painters Michelangelo and Raphael. So when and where did this intense rivalry occur? Its center was the opulent world of 16th century Rome, and it focused in and around the Vatican during the reign of one truly unique pope who was named Pope Julius II. Julius, whose given name was Giuliano della Rovere, was this mighty force to be reckoned with. He was even nicknamed the Warrior Pope, though this portrait that you can see on the screen of him as a very rather aging and ailing pontiff really doesn't showcase the dynamism of his early years that gave him that term, Warrior Pope. And in the span of a relatively brief reign as pontiff of about 10 to 15 years, he essentially transformed Rome from being stuck in the medieval Dark Ages to becoming the epicenter of architecture, grand humanist thought, and, of course, some of the best art that the world had ever seen prior to that point. What's interesting to me is that the story gives us the opportunity to not only look at an infamous rivalry between two artists, but it also affords us a very brief glimpse at another important rivalry at the time, and that was between the two incredible Italian cities of Florence in the north and Rome further south. So these cities, beginning in the 15th century and continuing onward for about 100 years, these cities dueled for the title of various categories, the top dog in various categories. One was that they were fighting to be the epicenter of art, the best city for classical antiquities, the foundations of Christian thought, and the most politically relevant towns and cities. So they parried back and forth, which each similarly grabbing the bar at various times. And what is amusing to me is that essentially both were seeking the title of New Rome and all that Rome in the ancient world had represented at that time. So things like the idea of victory, progress, the epitome of all great things in arts and culture, and this idea of the city as being the height of Western civilization. So during the Renaissance, Rome was literally trying to grab hold of the term of Rome. They were trying to maintain themselves as the leaders of this term and what Rome could represent. So go figure. One of the ways that Pope Julius was most influential during this height of this hope of attaining Roman victory in his rivalry was specifically through art. He followed in the footsteps of his uncle, who was himself a pope. His name was Pope Sixtus IV, and it's from Pope Sixtus IV that we get the term Sistine for Sistine Chapel, for example. And Julius opted to be as forward-thinking and as grand as possible in doing his best to renovate the Eternal City, especially the Vatican itself. During his years in power, he contracted with the best artists of the day to undergo these major building and renovation projects, including the complete overhaul of St. Peter's Basilica, and then also moving to create the most stunning works of art, especially in painting, that the world had yet seen. So this guy truly had this amazing sense of vision. And it's also fun to think that at the time, some of that vision was actually pretty shocking to the public. So I often like to point out the fact that at one time, all work of art that was being created, all works of art were considered contemporary. And that something that is now universally accepted or lauded in the time of its creation was actually deemed frightening or ugly or just odd or even just plain bad. People didn't always love art that was being created in their own time, just like now. So for me, it's a testament to Julius's confidence, not only in his own ideas, but also in those of the newest and snazziest artists of the time, that he did not choose to follow very sheep-like into rote copies of art that came before. He personally inspired newness, creativity, and innovation. Which is why it must have been rather unnerving to Vatican officials and also to the Pope's coterie when this young, confident, and rather blustery new artist burst onto the scene in 1504. Always keen on exploring new talent, Julius II had heard these rapturous accounts of the abilities of one young man named Raphael da Urbino, whom we'll call today simply Raphael. And Raphael was born in Urbino to a family who was already pretty established in the art world, with his father, Giovanni de Santi, who was a court painter to the Duke of Urbino. So he grew up in the Umbrian court, and that provided Raphael with the essential skills to learn all about art and then to succeed as an artist from a very early age. After working with his father as a child in his art studio, Giovanni arranged for his son to quickly study with Pietro Perugina, whose work of art you see here on the screen, who was another very famous Umbrian painter who quickly discovered Raphael's genius. It appears to have been one of these stories that is so popular with art historical accounts about the student who is surpassing the master, wherein the teacher is then humbled, if not a little bit disappointed, to find himself overshadowed by his ultra-talented apprentice. But from all accounts, it seems like Raphael wasn't a jerk about it. He was truly, truly talented, but he wasn't trying to really rub it in anybody's noses. From most accounts, Raphael was outgoing and charismatic and very easy to get along with. The granddaddy of art history and one of the first artist biographers of the Renaissance was a man named Giorgio Bizarri, and he even gushed about Raphael in his famous compilation called The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which is today sometimes just called The Lives. In his book about Raphael, Bizarri writes, quote, "The liberality with which heaven now and again unites in one person the inexhaustible riches of its treasures, and all those graces and rare gifts which are usually shared among many over a long period, is seen in Raphael's Stanza of Urbino, who was as excellent and gracious and endowed with a natural modesty and goodness sometimes seen in those who possess to an unusual degree a humane and gentle nature adorned with affability and good fellowship. And he always showed himself sweet and pleasant with persons of every degree and in all circumstances. So seriously, high praise indeed. After finding success in Urbino, both in Perugina's studio and also elsewhere, Raphael then moved on to that other great artistic city, Florence, and he went there to study the latest innovations and techniques in painting, gaining not only excellent experience, but also befriending other very influential artists and really then upping his game. So under the artistic guidance of people like Fra Bartolomeo, Raphael's constructions became more assured, greater, and grander. And when he learned these new perspective techniques from studying masterworks by Leonardo da Vinci, it culminated in Raphael reaching new artistic heights. There seemed to be no stopping him. It was really grand, and he was doing this all at a very young age, of late teens, early 20s. And it was at this point that Julius II, Pope, came calling. In 1508, Julius, who was about halfway through his run of Pope at this time, decided he needed a little sprucing up done in his papal apartments, especially in his public reception areas. So it turns out that this might have been inspired by a rivalry of the Pope's very own, because his predecessor and adversary, a man who went by the name of Pope Alexander VII, had commissioned an incredible fresco series in his own papal apartments, known today as the Borgia Apartments, by the Perugian painter Pinturicchio. And it just happened to be that Julius's papal apartments were positioned directly above the Borgia Apartments in the building itself. So his thought was, why not try to overshadow them a little bit in terms of their artistic value? In total, he assigned Raphael to paint 4 separate rooms in these papal apartments, and each had their own grand fresco design and theme. Raphael got right to work, and he literally spent the rest of his life completing these rooms, because he died tragically early in 1520 at the age of just 37. And in that decade, he finished about 3 out of the 4 rooms completely, and he left his 3 assistants behind to finish that final fresco in his absence and his memory. These rooms are typically referred to today as the Raphael Rooms, and they are now among the highlights of all high Renaissance art. His frescoes for the Stanza della Signatura, for example, is considered a true work of genius, and one that is included in every single art history survey course that has ever been in reference, especially to the work that you can see on the right side of your screen now, which is its most iconic element, a painting section called the School of Athens, which we will be talking about more momentarily. And again, I just love to point out the fact that Raphael was only 26-year-old when he began this incredibly ambitious and history-making project. So, no big deal. The appointment of Raphael to this project didn't commence without some grumbles and some detractors. And one of those detractors was not only one of the well-established heavyweights in all of Italy, who was creating masterpieces not only in Florence, but also in process of doing it again in Rome at that very moment. And this was Michelangelo Buonarroti. Michelangelo was born in the Tuscan town of Caprese in 1475, but he grew up in Florence, and that's where he made a huge splash as a classically inspired sculptor. He trained with the great Florentine master Domenico Ghirlandaio, and it was from him that he learned the basic techniques of painting before he gravitated towards 3-dimensional works of art, and whose own story about the teacher being surpassed by the student is also equally enthralling for those who would like to read up on that. So when Michelangelo arrived in 1508 to begin painting these papal apartments, Michelangelo had already been working there for nearly 3 years under the patronage of Pope Julius II, too. The Pope had invited the great sculptor, who was already famed for his monumental sculptures of David and also his tragically gorgeous Pietà, today in Florence and in the Vatican, respectively, and he was asked to complete his largest and most ambitious project yet, which was a grand tomb for Pope Julius himself. And it was meant to be placed in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli, or St. Peter in Chains, in another section of Rome. The story behind this tomb and all of its complications, its timeline, and all the details are really so dramatic that they deserve a really deep dive in its own right. But suffice to say that the tomb was never completed as Michelangelo had originally intended, and he considered it to be one of the biggest failures of his life. He would later refer to it as, quote, the tragedy of the tomb, unquote. And he bemoaned the time and energy that he wasted on its imposing and magnificent design. So here is an image of the tomb as it stands today. It is still quite incredible, but much smaller and less grand than he had originally intended. One of the reasons that there was so much trouble for Michelangelo's tomb project from the outset was that the Pope immediately lost interest in it, which is extremely strange considering that it was basically going to be an everlasting glorification of the Pope himself in his final resting place. So of course, after putting so much time and effort into it, Michelangelo was furious. He was the best sculptor in the game, and here he was, willing and ready to work. So he was really disturbed. Why was the Pope not more into this idea? When you read Bizarri's Lives today, which you mentioned earlier, it's easy to see that though he profiled dozens of artists in that book, Bizarri did have one clear favorite artist. And that favorite was Michelangelo. For Bizarri, he was the clear genius of the Renaissance who had excelled in all three areas of art: sculpture, painting, and architecture. So, of course, when it came to writing about both Michelangelo and Raphael together in the lives of the artists, Bizarri was very quick to take sides, and he put the blame for the failure of the tomb project squarely on one certain person's shoulders. And he writes, quote, Bramante, the friend and relation of Raphael, and therefore ill-disposed to Michelangelo, seeing the Pope's preference for sculpture, schemed to divert his attention and told the Pope that it would be a bad omen to get Michelangelo to go on with his tomb, as it would seem to be an invitation to death, unquote. Bramante, Donato Bramante, that is, who was a famed architect, also originally from Urbino, was really looking for the well-being of his hometown boy, Raphael. They both came from the same town and knew each other. So understandably, this put Bramante in Michelangelo's bad graces as well. But surely it would have been embarrassing for Michelangelo just in light of this conjunction with Raphael. Here was this huge opportunity for his greatest sculpture ever being practically taken away from him, and with funding and energy being funneled instead to this young hotshot artist who was nearly a decade his junior. So furious and not a little bit ashamed, Michelangelo fled Rome and he found solace back in Florence. And that could have been the end of the story, with Michelangelo staying there in Florence, licking his wounds, and passing the baton of great Renaissance painting to that next generation. But that is not what happened. What happened next is even more interesting. Not terribly long after Michelangelo left Rome, he was summoned back by Julius. So though the Pope had not canceled the commission for the tomb, his passion for it just wasn't once what it was. But he did have a new project that he was currently excited about. And that was that he wanted to repaint the entire ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Originally, the ceiling's design was embellished with something rather simple, which was these painted blue and golden emblazoned stars on the ceiling that were possibly representing the constellations or the zodiac. So Julius subscribed to this idea of go big or go home, and he decided, why not switch it up? Also, I think we can think about this ever-competitive Pope also wanting to not be outdone by his own uncle, who was, of course, Pope Sixtus, by really improving upon his uncle's own project. So that's kind of amazing and a little ruthless, but for me, I always think, you've got to hand it to him. This was one truly bold, visionary Pope. The funny thing is that, according to Bizarri, the twin minds of none other than Bramante and Raphael conspired to get Michelangelo the job of painting the Sistine ceiling. And they weren't recommending him for the position out of guilt or pity or anything like that. Most probably, they were hoping that he would fail drastically. And to be fair, they at least had a little reason to be confident that Michelangelo would probably screw it all up. As Bizarri notes in his book, quote, his rivals hoped to confound him, for by taking him from sculpture, in which he was perfect, and then putting him to coloring in fresco, in which he had no experience, they thought he would produce less admirable work than Raphael, and even if he succeeded, he would become embroiled with the Pope, for whom they wished to separate him. Thus, when Michelangelo returned to Rome, the Pope was disposed not to have the tomb finished for the time being, and asked him to paint the vaulting of the chapel. Michelangelo tried every means to avoid it, and even recommended Raphael, for he saw the difficulty of the work, knew his lack of skill in coloring, and wanted to finish the tomb, unquote. Not that Michelangelo had no painting experience, of course. He had learned much of it under his work with Ghirlandaio, and had even completed a truly stunning painting of the Holy Family on a circular panel, now called the Donitondo, and found today in Florence's Uffizi Gallery. And Bizarri's line about Michelangelo's, quote, lack of skill in coloring actually makes me laugh, because not only do the glistening tones of the Donitondo that you see on the screen here are truly amazing, but also considering what we have seen about the Sistine Chapel post-restoration, it itself being another topic that I've covered on the Art Curious podcast, which we'll discuss shortly in a moment as well. Regardless, Raphael and Bramante were right, because Michelangelo had never frescoed before. And fresco is notoriously tricky to do, and even some truly incredibly talented artists like Leonardo had some major difficulties with it. So I'm showing you here as an example for evidence his crumbling and continuously endangered Last Supper fresco. Fresco involves painting a mural onto fresh, wet plaster, and it requires fast and extremely precise work because the action must be completed before the plaster itself dries. And then once it does, the painting basically becomes embedded into the wall itself. Also, keep in mind that we're not just talking one small wall that was being requested of Michelangelo to paint, but instead a vaulted ceiling that's 68 feet off the ground and covering a length of about 131 feet long by 43 feet wide. So this meant that Michelangelo was being asked to create more than 5,000 square feet of frescoes without hardly having any fresco experience. So I personally can see why Michelangelo balked. This was an insane plan, and Raphael and Bramante knew it. So how much, if anything, Pope Julius knew about this possible backstabbing and the motivations between the rivals is really, to me, unknown. But one thing is certain. Julius was a shrewd risk-taker, and like many of the other greatest patrons of art, he was very savvy when it came to choosing the right artist for the right project. And he certainly didn't have to go along with Bramante and Raphael's assumption or assertion about Michelangelo being the right guy for the Sistine Chapel, after he had already agreed with them to ditch Michelangelo's tomb for the time being. He didn't have to do it a second time. The fact of the matter is that Michelangelo was a perfectionist, and he would not only rise to the challenge of painting the ceiling, but he would also transform a middling Vatican building into this premier showstopper of any Roman tour today. Not that they knew that at the time, of course, and not that Michelangelo's perfectionism was one that was taken easily or made the job easily done. During the course of the 4 years that he spent working on the Sistine ceiling, Michelangelo went out to fire all of his assistants one by one, and essentially opted to complete this vast majority of the project single-handedly. And this slowed down the timeline to completion and made the Pope very, very grumpy. And he would constantly stop by to see Michelangelo at work and grumble at him constantly to just hurry up and finish the darn job already, which was something that was really dramatized to great effect in The Agony and the Ecstasy, a film from 1965 that's starring, as you can see on screen, Charlton Heston as Michelangelo and Rex Harrison as Pope Julius. The great irony of all of this is that though all of the artists involved basically thought the project was doomed from the get-go, the joke was actually on Bramante and Raphael. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel has solidified Michelangelo's place as one of the greatest painters, and, again, as I mentioned earlier, a supreme colorist at that. and this reputation has only skyrocketed with the passage of time. According to the most recent numbers that I could find, which are from 2015, approximately 6 million people enter the chapel every year to feast their eyes upon just the ceiling alone, with up to 2,000 entering at a time during peak summer season and obviously before COVID-19. So if you've ever been lucky enough to stand in line to visit the chapel, you'll understand just how crowded this process can be. It is truly a top draw of the sprawling and completely treasure-filled Vatican collections. And visitors today have to take a very circuitous, serpentine route through these collections, going gallery to gallery, before ending up in the Sistine as this kind of climax to the entire experience. What some tourists don't realize as they're running through to see the chapel is that they also pass through the Raphael Rooms on that same route. So it's almost like through sheer modern day popularity, the rivalry between Michelangelo and Raphael has already been put to an end here. Michelangelo's Ceiling wins, bar none. And Raphael, in the Vatican today at least, seems to take second place. I have visited the Vatican Collection a couple of times thus far in my life, and every time I'm really awed by the Sistine Ceiling, of course, as I think many people are. But I almost feel a stronger love for Raphael's rooms. It's not like they are ever deserted by any means, and thankfully there are always plenty of art lovers and knowledgeable tourists who stop and appreciate these rooms on their own accord. But to deny that fewer tourists spend time gaping at them, and certainly not in as much audible awe and appreciation, that would be a lie. They are just as important in the span of art history, and just as technically proficient and just as beautiful. But to us, they really do seem less flashy. I will admit that. Regardless, when the Sistine Ceiling was completed in 1512 and was revealed to the public for the very first time, Raphael, who was still smack dab in the midst of painting these stanze, these rooms, he must have felt intense pressure. Bizarri uses the dramatic moment of the completion of the Sistine Chapel as another way to present us with a portrait of Raphael's chicanery and untrustworthiness. With the assistance of his old pal Bramante, Raphael apparently stole into the Sistine Chapel in Michelangelo's absence to get a sneak peek of the work before it was revealed to the public. When Michelangelo heard this, all hell broke loose. He was furious and flat out accused Raphael of plagiarizing his own work, writing in a letter, quote, "Everything he knows about art he got from me," unquote. Okay, technically, of course, this was not true, since Raphael had studied with other great artists before even coming to Rome and meeting Michelangelo, and his talent really stood on its own. But Michelangelo does have some kind of a point, because in that same year, 1512, Michelangelo completed work on a commission of his own, which was a fresco of the prophet Isaiah for the Basilica di Sant'Agostino, which was an early Renaissance church just across from the Tiber River from the Vatican. And who had painted an image of the same prophet in the 16 ceiling earlier? Michelangelo. So yeah, the similarities, while not perfect, are striking enough, because both of these prophets are monumental in scale, and they are imbued with movement and bright colors, and both are attended to these putti, these cute little naked cherubs that you see all around Renaissance paintings. So again, they are not identical by any means, but I can see why Michelangelo could have called it a kind of plagiarism. So it's possible that any likeness to Michelangelo's works may have been Raphael's way of acknowledging a new, better way to depict the human figure. So in a way, there's real flattery in that. And it is also in line with the way that artists usually work, especially when they are first starting out, whereupon they copy these masterworks over and over again in hopes of developing and honing their technique. Sketches remain from Raphael's very early days in Florence, where he was copying pieces by Leonardo, Donatello, and even that of his future rival, Michelangelo. But, I always think, good luck getting Michelangelo to see it as anything but a big, fat kick in the pants. For him, it could not be flattery. It can only be sacrilege. When it comes to most of the primary evidence for this greatest of Renaissance feuds, we have to notice that most of our evidence for this rivalry comes from Giorgio Bizarri, himself not only a strong supporter of Michelangelo, but also a known gossip who favored these salacious fables over fact. So it is entirely possible that he made up a lot of the melodrama here as a way to side with his own camp, and that he's a little bit of an unreliable narrator. But there's still at least one little historical in-joke that survives on Raphael's side to confirm that there was a true sense of competition between the two artists. And that's where we cycle back to his greatest fresco, the School of Athens, which was completed between 1509 and 1511. So that is saying concurrent with the painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The School of Athens is this one large painting that presents viewers with all the greatest mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists from classical antiquity. So it was conceived as truly the greatest minds of all time up to that point, all gathered in this image of this imaginary same space and same time. At the center of the composition are two figures, Plato on the left, who points at the sky and holds a book, which is his celebrated text called the Timaeus, in which he explored the universe. And on the right next to him is Aristotle, who gestures to the ground and holds his Ethics, a work in which he studied how we should best live our lives on Earth, here and now. So other various and sundry toga-wearing figures are filling this imaginary architectural space that resembles a courtyard of an ancient philosophical school or even a palace. What's really interesting to me is how Raphael chose to depict these figures, because instead of creating an imaginary cast of characters that was just based on his own thoughts and ideas, he instead opted to insert portraits of many of the greatest minds of his own day. So Bramante, for example, became noted that he looks an awful lot like the painting, where am I? I just lost my place, For example, it's been noted that Plato looks an awful lot like Leonardo da Vinci, and that Bramante, as you can see on the right side, has himself been included as Euclid, the brilliant mathematician. And that all makes a lot of sense concerning the necessity of math knowledge, a lot of math knowledge for architects, especially back in the Renaissance. Raphael even supposedly included himself in the form of Apelles, who was known as the greatest painter of antiquity. But there's one figure that has been long noted by historians as being really interesting and a little different. Just at the left of the center of the painting, seated on the steps here, is the figure of Heraclitus, who was a Greek philosopher from the 6th century BCE. Now, this figure is a really curious one because it appears not to have been part of Raphael's original design, and it is absent from all of his cartoons, which are his initial drawings that he made for this specific program. Moreover, he appears to have chosen someone very specific to be the body and face of his Heraclitus, and that person was Michelangelo. It has been suggested that Raphael added this figure of Michelangelo / Heraclitus after he got that sneak peek at the Sistine ceiling, and some have originally read it as a compliment, that Michelangelo's ceiling was such a monumental achievement that Raphael found it necessary to add him in and amongst these other contemporary bigwigs. However, according to Ross King in his popular book, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, if it was indeed a compliment, there was a dark side to this compliment. It was perhaps a backhanded one. King writes, quote, Heraclitus of Ephesus, known both as Heraclitus the Obscure and the Weeping Philosopher, believed the world to be in a constant state of flux, a proposition summed up best by his two most famous sayings, "You cannot step in the same river twice," and "The sun is new every day." But it is not this philosophy of universal change that seems to have inclined Raphael to lend him the features of Michelangelo. More like it was Heraclitus's legendary sour temper and the bitter scorn that Heraclitus had for all of his rivals. He heaped derision upon predecessors such as Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Hecataeus. He even abused Homer, claiming that the blind poet should have been horsewhipped. The citizens of Ephesus were no more popular with the cantankerous philosopher. Every one of them, he wrote, ought to be hanged, unquote. So, Michelangelo in the School of Athens. Is it a compliment, or is it just another way for these artists to needle one another? Who knows? For me, I personally think it might even be both. So before I end talking about Michelangelo and Raphael today, I want to remind you again that I tell stories just like this one on my podcast called Art Curious, which again explores the unexpected, the slightly odd, and the strangely wonderful in art history. So you can subscribe to it for free and listen on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever else you get your podcasts, including Spotify. Or you can listen to it on my website, which is artcuriouspodcast.com. And if I may promote just one more thing, it is that I have my first book coming out in just 3 weeks, and it's based on the podcast and shares 12 stories just like the one I shared today. So again, all about the fun, strange, and relatively unknown parts of art history. It is coming out in stores on September 15th, but it can be pre-ordered online now wherever you get your books for sale, and that includes everywhere, including Target, Walmart, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. And it would, of course, mean the world to me, and I hope that it would be an enjoyable read for you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I know that people might be tuning in elsewhere, but if anybody has questions that they might have, please feel free to let me know.